Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 271, Layering. Jill P.O.V. Jill was thoroughly annoyed with her skills. She didn't have the most creative mind when it came to her class. She fought in the most obvious way. It wasn't bad as that mindset had made her near invincible. Plus, she didn't go through the same learning process that MASH had to. MASH constantly got new skills and abilities and spent almost all of his free time practicing. For all that he claimed to not train enough, MASH spent a lot of time experimenting with his skills. He just didn't seem to consider it the same thing. She couldn't be like him. Skills were simple things to her, and she didn't really care about this test. Passing or failing was largely unimportant. It just felt kind of amusing at the moment. She didn't really mess with skills. When she trained, she usually only tried to make the skill work as it intended. Even then she wasn't the best at it. A memory flashed into her mind, and she remembered what had happened within MASH's world. It had been a mistake when she had done it before, but it might be a good time to try again. Spatial manipulation was supposed to do more than just break things, but she couldn't get it to work. She didn't think she could upgrade the skill regardless of the advice MASH had gotten from the Northerner. Marking her weapon hadn't even been her own idea. Red was the one who had suggested it. She was good at thinking through things, although she did overdo it at times. She held the weapon in one hand and tried again to make a barrier in space. A wall that she could put up to protect herself or the others. That was what she had worked on before, though she hadn't risked it again. Luke was close enough now, and this seemed like a relatively safe space to run some tests. Everyone here should be strong enough to survive an explosion like before, although she wasn't planning on letting that happen again. Unless she could make it more controlled, which might be doable. The arena they were in was big and she had more than enough space to mess around. She imagined the space in front of her firming up. Hardening wasn't the right way to describe what she was doing. It was more like she made it more resistant to change. The space just stayed as it was. She started with a wide range, but slowly focused on a small point. The last time she broke the wall the explosion had been big. The barrier then had been fairly large too. This time she made one that was a little bigger than a coin. She practiced a little bit on just making the barrier. She made a few barriers and struck some of them with her fist. They held, but her fist wasn't really all that strong. If only she had something stronger. Something other than her weapon. She was worried that testing the barrier with that would cause more explosions. Perhaps she could get 51 to use his fire magic. The sudden sound of thunder made her flinch a little bit. It only bothered her for a moment. She was somewhat used to MASH's antics now. The sound was a little strange this time though, and she turned to see what he was up to. She saw him standing in front of a section of scorched dirt and spotted 51 standing next to him. She considered asking them to test the limits of her barrier but decided she could do that later. In reality, she just didn't want 51 to start bothering her. For whatever reason, he was clinging to MASH, and she would prefer to keep it that way. There was the second thing she wanted to test anyways. She held her needle in her hand. Marking it had been revolutionary for her combat style. The weapon was shaped like a javelin, but she hadn't even considered throwing it before. It was only once Red had given her the idea for the mark and that was what made her learn how to throw it properly. Although that was pretty easy. A weapon that could shear through space just kind of traveled straight no matter how he threw it. It was still affected by gravity, but it wasn't really hard to use. Jill turned toward the barriers she had made and let all but one of them vanish. It was weird, but she could see the walls even if they would be invisible to anyone else. The one she left was far away and was no bigger than a coin. She walked even further away from it until she was over 50 feet from the barrier. After making sure she was far enough away, she raised her right hand and threw her weapon at the tiny barrier. Her aim was almost always perfect, and she knew that it was probably an aspect of her skill or the weapon itself. The tip of the needle struck the barrier and penetrated it. This time she could see the explosion without experiencing it firsthand. The barrier and the space around it vibrated. Then it warped and was sucked inward for a moment. An instant later it was just gone. She thought for a moment that there would be no explosion, but then it happened. The space that had been erased quickly expanded, and then ripples shot out from the location. Everything seemed to ripple with it. She saw it pass through her body but felt almost nothing. She stared wide-eyed at the location of the barrier. The dirt was just gone, but around the clean crater were streaks of dirt. Dirt that had been displaced like water when someone threw a rock into a pond. A hesitant smile grew on her face. The power of that was horrifying. She imagined using it on a person, erasing them from existence. There would be nothing left to bury. It was a frightening thought, but another image popped into her mind. A god's hand reaching down. The creature's hand touching her, and the endless amount of pain that it had caused. Jill stared at the explosion, and her hesitant smile turned into a true one. This was an attack like none other. This would be able to hurt even that creature. Hopefully, it would be enough to kill it. She felt some eyes on her back and turned. Mash stood in the distance. He seemed worried, but Jill still smiled. She yelled. I did it. Mash P.O.V. Mash was back to working on his own skill. Despite what Jill had yelled, she hadn't actually upgraded a skill. Everyone had walked over when she yelled, but she soon explained what had happened. It was incredible in a sense, but it wasn't what they expected. Although, Mash saw the effectiveness of the new attack. She demonstrated it once more, and Mash noticed the other two step away warily. Seeing the arrogant southerner step away in fear was rather pleasing. Although Mash himself was a little worried about the attack, it was not the kind of thing that he was excited about. She would presumably be using that skill in fights, and his role would place him closest to such an attack. He was confident in his body's durability. It was probably the thing he was most sure of. With that said, he didn't know if he could resist being erased. It was magical, so he figured his anti-magic would help. Plus, he had a touch of nothingness which should help too. He probably wouldn't get erased. It would probably hurt though. His hands shook a little at the thought. Do not test it. I wouldn't. His excitement was not enough to encourage him to test the limits of his defense. Especially not with something that deadly. Not yet at least. Although who knew, he might be strong enough after upgrading his body. He didn't think that there was truly any all-powerful magic, so he should be able to resist it in theory. Priscilla's words did get him to refocus on the task at hand. He needed to change his wood fundamentally, to the point that even his skill changed for it. His thunder wood had the lightning and wood affinity already. It didn't even have the life affinity according to Priscilla. She suggested that affinity would be the easiest to mix. Mental should work too. He had already done that one before. That was the first step. He slowly let wood grow from his hand, and he imagined filling it with life. He held the picture of a tree or shrub. Something that was truly alive. Instead of a simple piece of wood growing from him, he imagined a tree. He used his life affinity. He tried to mix it with the creation. To create life. True life, not like those cheap imitations that he normally made. Even those were nothing more than a product of magic. This would be different. He would make something that could live on its own. His wood grew, but this time its appearance was different from normal. It was still black, but it wasn't scaled anymore. The bark was thick, layered oddly as it grew, but there were no more scales. It was strange, but he continued, and the wood continued to grow, layer after layer. It was slower than normal, and it felt weaker than what he normally made. Only once the final layer was growing, did it start to overlap. The bark of the tree started overlapping itself awkwardly, and he saw the vague imitations of scales on it. They weren't real scales, and it was closer to normal wood now. Although no normal tree could be this shade of black. Then something interesting happened as he continued to pour energy into the wood. Its shape changed slightly, and branches started sprouting from its side. He had been growing it out from his arm, and he could see branches and leaves beginning to appear at the end. Mash stared at it with amazement. It was working. His first attempt and the unliving wood had changed. It was alive, and Mash could feel roots growing into his arm. It didn't feel harmful. It felt like his connection to it was stronger now than before. His other hand ran down the tree's bark, and he felt the grooves and indents. Unlike before, they weren't like perfectly shaped scales. The bark was layered similarly, though there was no consistency in size or shape. Some pieces of the bark were simply bigger or misshapen. It made the tree feel more real, more alive. 51 had been watching Jill after her last experiment, but Mash felt it when he entered his domain. He wasn't alone either. Jill and Luke had come with him, and he would bet that Red was watching too. The two foreigners probably didn't understand the significance and hadn't approached. Mash himself was more than a little dazed by the situation. What he was doing now was creating life. It wasn't a taboo, but he imagined that was because it wasn't very common. The tree Mash made now was a living thing. Mash slowly lowered his arm to the ground and let the roots move from him to the ground. He stared at the new tree in awe as he stepped away from it. It stood on its own and lived on its own. He knew that it wouldn't decay or warp, even after he cut his connection to it. It was, for all intents and purposes, nothing more than a tree. Chapter 272, Life Magic. Mash glanced at the others, and he could tell that they had some questions. His friends seemed especially curious, but Mash waved them away. They seemed to warily accept the motion. He spoke softly, but loud enough that they could still hear. "I'll tell you guys when I'm done." He was in the zone. His mind was solely focused on his magic, and he didn't want to interrupt the flow. After all, he still needed to figure out how to utilize his other affinities. The best part was, he already had an idea of how to do it. His eyes bore into the tree. The tree had been a part of him, and he still remembered how it had formed. It was layered, over a dozen times too. That had given him an idea about how to utilize his other affinities. He tried to think of all of his affinities but knew that there were too many for his plan. Instead, he needed to know which of his affinities could mix. "I have a list." Priscilla did in fact have a list. An image stuck itself to Mash's mind. He could practically see a literal list in his eyes. His affinities were sorted with how they combined, and Mash saw that wood surprisingly worked with most. It could combine with both lightning and fire, although not at the same time. Other things that made more sense like water were there too. There was some weird stuff like demonic magic, although Priscilla suggested that those needed to be tested. She had an idea for most elements, but the things he had received from otherworldly monsters were something that needed to be studied more. Mash knew that he would need to test every single combination before trying his plan out. That wouldn't even guarantee success. It was just the minimum requirement to know how could mix his affinities. Thus, the excruciating hour and a half of testing had begun. Priscilla had kept adding to the list as he worked, and it had taken a while. It was also a huge drain on his energy. He had to keep his dragon form up the whole time, which forced him to recover 3 times during the tests. At least it was over now. All of the affinities that could be mixed with wood had been. Many conflicts had arisen in the process, but he had managed it for his most important ones. One interesting discovery he had in his testing was learning that his life affinity could work with any other affinity. Death apparently acted similarly. That was something Priscilla hadn't even known. It was only an assumption based on their tests. It was good enough though. That discovery had only bolstered his confidence. He explained his plan to Priscilla, and she hadn't immediately rejected it. That was practically encouragement when it came from her. Despite the long trials, he was still excited. If this worked, it would make his wooden creations 1,000 times more versatile. However, he knew that these tests would be even more destructive than the previous. His previous tests had only been with 2 or 3 affinities at most. This would be with most of them. At least all of the ones that could mix with wood in any combination. Their experimentation revealed that demonic magic was not compatible with wood in any form. If his plan worked out, then he probably wouldn't be using the demon magic anymore. Anti-magic didn't mix either, though he had expected that. Mash remembered the way his wood had grown in layers. That was what he was hoping to use. He would make multiple layers within the wood. Each layer would be made of a different combination of magic. The center would be the same as before, but the next layer would be fire and wood. The wood began to grow from his hand as it did before. The colors of the wood shifted as the layers formed. The center was tinged with a dark blue, and the next layer was ever so slightly orange. Although he didn't really get a good look at it. The wood and magic in his hand erupted, and as he expected, it was several times stronger than before. The explosion was bright, and Mash felt like he had been hit by a giant hammer. His arm swung toward his body, and he actually punched his own chest. It hurt, but that wasn't the worst of it. The force of the explosion carried him off his feet completely. He shot across the arena, skidding and rolling across the ground until his back hit a wall. Mash grunted in pain. The explosion and even the crash hadn't hurt all that much, but his own fist had. It seemed like he could damage himself, even in his dragon form. He raised his eyes to the site of the explosion. It had been so loud that his ears were ringing a little. From what he could see, it had caused the others' ears to ring too. Everyone was staring at it, and the northerner had even covered his ears. Pieces of fragmented wood were scattered all over the ground. They completely covered the crater and the surrounding area. Yet, there was a crater that was almost 10 feet wide there too. The piece of wood had barely been bigger than his arm. but the explosion was significantly larger. In his mind, the devastation only reaffirmed his desire to figure it out. Although he paused as his head throbbed a little. Mash was surprised as he recognized the feeling. It was a headache. When had he last had a real headache? How did even get one? He had a lot of items and abilities that should prevent something so mundane. It is all of the testing. Even if you are talented, your mind is still susceptible to fatigue. You should be able to recover with your skill. Fatigue was something he could deal with. The cause still felt mundane, but he listened to Priscilla's suggestion and sat down. He meditated for a little longer than he needed. His skill seemed to work slowly on the headache. Does casting magic normally involve your mind? Mash's question felt dumb as he asked, but he was able to send the intention behind the question to Priscilla as well. She didn't immediately reply, and when she did it was more than he expected. It depends on the person and the magic. Normally, when you would use a skill, the system seems to handle all of the mental tasks. However, what you are doing now is performing all of your magic without relying on any skills. Talent alone cannot allow you to ignore the drain on your mind. Mash nodded. It was just another reason to try and make this into a skill, or just leave the task to Priscilla. No, he didn't want to do that. He spent a few minutes recovering and then walked back toward where the explosion had happened. Mash bent down and picked up some of the fragments of wood. They felt warm in his hands, each was almost as hot as a fire. It felt like it should have worked. The two pieces of wood could touch together easily enough. So, what was the problem earlier? He thought about it for a while but didn't really understand what the problem was. It felt like it should have worked. He had been growing a frown, and it deepened as his experimentation only resulted in explosions. He had tried several different combinations of affinities, but each attempt failed regardless of what he tried. The wood just didn't want to grow together. He needed to connect them somehow. Link them together with something. He thought about it and the realization smacked him directly in the face. Every layer of wood had two affinities that could connect. Both life and wood could be linked between the layers. What if he tried making intermediary layers of pure wood and life magic? He didn't test immediately but then he checked with Priscilla first. It might work. This idea of yours is not something I would have tried, but I believe it has a chance to work. He could visualize what he wanted. The layers would fuse at their edges and combine with the next layer. This was a much more complex design, and it was complex. It was like trying to sew, but with 10 needles at once. He somehow knew that if it didn't work, he would get a horrible headache from the attempt alone. Maybe he should recover before trying? No, he felt like the design would fade from his mind if he took a break. He would push through. Mash held his hand in front of him. The dirt beneath him was not covered in shards of wood. He moved regularly and many craters were covered in the ground around him. There was a lot. How much time had passed? How many times had he failed? He didn't know, and he didn't care. The difficulty of the task didn't deter him. His failures didn't hang on him. All of it encouraged him. He felt like he was closer than ever and couldn't help but smile before his next test. The smile didn't go away as the first part of the wood grew from his hand. He didn't slow down and immediately started on the next layer. This time he fused the wood together. His wood and life affinity blended the two layers together, and they didn't explode. It was a moment of inspiration, a surge of confidence that urged him onward. The next layer began, and he repeated the process. It was a magical moment, and he soon found himself falling into a rhythm. The process became easier, and the wood took the shape in his mind. It grew rapidly, and he grinned as its branches started to sprout. He didn't intend for that but didn't really care. The wood began to shape itself into a draconic maw, and the branches and leaves were just scattered randomly along its surface. It was probably a byproduct of the life magic that was woven into the entire tree. The draconic form was less realistic than before. The color of the wood had changed slightly. It was brighter than before. Now the scale-like shape of the bark was basically completely gone. It was still fractured as if there should be scales, but there was no pattern to the size or shape. The bark looked like it had broken like glass. It was far more like normal wood. He could control the wood like before, and it moved as he made it open and close its mouth. Even the sharpest sections of wood didn't look like they could tear through bone, although were certainly shaped like teeth. Although there was another noticeable improvement to his sculpture. It was alive. It idled and swayed like a real living creature. A monster rather than a simple creation. Connected to the creation as he was, Mash could feel its inside moving. The wood was shaped into muscles and moved as if it were truly alive. He thought that it might actually breathe if it could. He still felt that inspiration and didn't hesitate to feed it. Priscilla helped as she read his intentions. She guided his magic, the affinities, the life. The draconic shape changed. It had been a simple mouth, but it quickly changed to the entire head. The wooden sculpture kept growing from him. A body quickly accompanied the head, and before long a wooden dragon, a small one, stood on the ground before him. The moment of inspiration passed as the creature opened its mouth and roared. At that same moment, Mash felt a familiar rush of energy. Chapter 273, Imparting Life. Mash couldn't help but clench his hands into fists. The success filled him with pride. In his mind, it was the first time that he managed to live up to the words Priscilla had said before. He had done something amazing. His clothes were covered in dirt, which was a testament to how many failures he experienced. The blood-bonded clothes were hard to stain. They could only get dirty if Mash himself was dirty. However, the many explosions had made him exactly that. There was no hesitation or delay this time. He looked inward and sought after the changes to his status. Eager to see how his skills had changed and adapted. Name, Mash Stel Lumbra Class, Chimeric Vagabond. Level, 112. Health, 3000/3300. Energy, 4400/4400. Fortitude, 330. Endurance, 210. Strength, 275. Agility, 275. Intelligence, 230. Wisdom, 120/130. Charisma, 110. Free stats, 40. Skills, Hunt, Thunderwood Creation Magical Layered Wood, Inhuman Hibernation, Chimeric Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation Wooden Birth, Chimeric Reconstruction, Vagabond's Path, Chimeric Domain, Adaptable Monster Core, Chimera's Constitution, Wooden Body, Mimic's Avarice, A Touch of Nothingness, Golden Body. Thunderwood Creation Magical Layered Wood, you know how deadly sticks can be. Forge your magic into your wooden creations. Your magic has been layered into the wood, allowing it to carry every kind of magic. Its durability and resistance increase with your affinity. Thunderwood Imitation Wooden Birth, form imitations of creatures you have consumed, imitating some of their bodily functions through your wood. Impart your own life into the creature to grant them true vestiges of life. He wore a broad smile as he saw the changes. The smile froze as the implications of the skills hit him. The change to his stats was nominal, but the skills were a little bit stranger. His magical layered wood seemed like a strict improvement. Plus, it implied that it would grow and adapt automatically. He wouldn't have to do anything else, just keep getting new magic. He wondered if it had already adapted to the rest of his affinities. There were a few that he hadn't been able to mix. He would need to test and see if even those had been added. Although, the thing that had made his smile break was the next change. Wooden Birth was problematic, both in name and implication. The skill itself complicated things along with the drain on his health. The small dragon before him had taken 300 health. That wasn't a lot and he could recover it quickly, but it meant that he couldn't just make an army of imitations like before. This didn't feel like a strict upgrade, but that would depend on what the creatures could do. However, that was only one part of the problem. He was creating life. He made a living being. Even if it was made of wood, it was still alive. Priscilla implied that it was probably like her bodies, but that didn't really ease his concerns. Priscilla's other bodies could think. Did that mean his creations could do the same? What did that even mean? Would they give levels to people when they were killed? If he made imitations of himself, would it have its own levels? Could they resist his commands? Was he okay with sending creatures that could think to die? A sigh escaped his lips, as question after question popped into his head. Wooden Birth was a skill he hadn't been expecting, and he had so much he needed to test. Mash hesitated though. The tests weren't kind, especially if the creations had their own thoughts. Wouldn't it be cruel to create and kill them? Even using them in fights would be wrong, right? They are yours, they belong to you. Imagine yourself like a summoner. Priscilla's words were a little reassuring, but he was thinking along the same lines already. He still wanted to talk to someone else. It was time to get some other opinions and tell 51 that he had finished. He looked around and noticed the others were still working. Jill seemed to have stopped. She was just sitting by 51 and eating something. Mash wondered how much time had passed. He had definitely missed lunch, but what about dinner? His stomach rumbled as he spotted the food. It was better than just standing around, and he started walking over. He paused when he felt a loud thump behind him. Mash glanced back and saw that his dragon planned to follow him. Mash stared at the dragon, and just shrugged his shoulders before proceeding. The dragon's loud footsteps turned some heads, including his friends. Mash could see them walking over too and grinned madly as he looked at them. His gaze gave away the secret, but they were already looking past him. They stared at the dragon, and Mash could understand why. The dragon would be considered a masterpiece. The way it moved was mesmerizing. Not because it was weird, but rather it was because it was too natural. It even mimicked the motion of breathing, though he knew it didn't actually do that. His previous imitations would look more animal-like with the black scales that had grown on his wood. Now that they were gone, it was more clearly a sculpture. A wooden carving, although these were definitely more alive. How was it possible that it looked more alive despite losing its scales? He didn't understand but touched the wooden dragon with his hand. The wood wasn't smooth. It was like real bark and felt rough to his fingers. It wasn't scaled either, but the impression of scales could be seen on the surface. The detail was in its face, in the way it moved. The way the eyes blinked as it turned its head from side to side was ominous. It was a primal curiosity of a creature that had never seen the world. Mash moved his gaze beyond the creature's head to its wings and tail. The wings were made of branches. A countless number of branches layered over top of one another, and large leaves covered any gaps. The leaves were thick too. They were about as thick as his arm and as big as his head. The blackish wood was odd, but the leaves were even stranger. The leaves were multicolored, covering all of the colors he would see on a rainbow. There were even some white and black leaves mixed in. The tail was thick and had several branches near the end. Small leaves covered the end of the tail, turning into a bushy tail that didn't really belong to a dragon. The subtle movements of both were lifelike. Curiosity made him ask a question. Fly. He said the word as a command, just like he would with his imitations. The dragon raised its head and opened its wings. It opened its wings as wide as it could. The creature's wingspan was enormous, and it stretched them out before beating them. Mash felt wind magic coming from the creature too. It was mimicking how he normally flew. One final beat of the wings pushed some of the dirt aside. The creature took to the air and flew into the sky. Mash felt a mental link to the creature and knew that he could give it instructions, but he didn't know if it would listen. How would he even test that? Ask it to kill itself. The link is similar to the ones I make, but there are some differences that I cannot explain. A test is necessary. Mash grimaced at the thought, and he watched the dragon fly about with more than a little curiosity. Priscilla's suggestion felt a little cruel, but he could see the value of it. He needed to make sure that the things he made wouldn't just rampage like real monsters. It was little more than a summon. Less than one. That was what he told himself. He was about to command it, to test it as Priscilla suggested, but stopped when he heard a voice. What did you do? Mash heard Luke speak. It made him flinch and jump in place. The fact that Luke had been able to sneak up on him spoke volumes. He had been so focused, so distracted that he hadn't even noticed the others entering his domain. They saw his surprise, but Mash spoke before they could comment on it. I upgraded my skills. His voice carried his excitement, and he spoke as fast as he could. The words tumbled together, but they got the idea. Skills? How many skills? Red commented quickly. Mash didn't flinch this time. When he noticed Luke, he took in all of his surroundings. His friends had all approached, and he noticed signs of dirt on everyone but Red. Her body, clothes included, was made of blood. She literally couldn't get dirty anymore. 51 actually hadn't joined his friends but remained well out of earshot. Only his friends were close enough to listen, but he didn't trust distance alone. He didn't want to go into the details of any of his skills. Even if he passed the test, he didn't plan on joining the organization either way. He only wanted to gain as much information as he could. Not here. Mash spoke and held his hand out. A wooden arch started to grow from the ground, and the others nodded. At the same moment, he called his dragon back. Mash thought about leaving it here, but he didn't trust the other three. One of them might kill it. Thus, he made sure to make the portal large enough to fit the creation as well. It made the creation take a little while, and he could see Luke holding his tongue. Luke seemed like he had something to say, but he knew better than to ask questions here. The portal finished, and the four of them entered it quickly. Mash's dragon entered last. They were in an empty space within his world. He didn't recognize the location. The grass was short, and he realized that he couldn't see anything other than grass. They were in a plain, and one that stretched on for a very long time. He didn't close the portal immediately. It took a lot of energy to make, and it would take a while if he wanted to open another. However, he imagined that 51 would enter if he left it alone. That ultimately made him close the portal. As the portal closed, Luke exploded and started speaking urgently. What is that thing? I can see it has life. It has a soul, Mash. How? Mash heard the anger in Luke's voice. He didn't have an answer though. It wasn't like explaining his skill would be enough. It certainly wouldn't be the answer that Luke wanted to hear. It's a skill. It let me make living imitations. Luke had been glaring, but now a frown joined it. That's not it. Its soul is empty. There's nothing there. What? Luke was shouting, but Mash cut him off. Now it was Mash's turn to be confused. What did Luke mean? The genuine confusion on his face got Luke to pause. They both just spent several seconds staring at one another. Luke's glare slowly vanished and turned to disbelief. Mash grew more confused as he tried to understand what Luke said. Jill broke the silent showdown. Can you explain for the rest of us? Thus began a long explanation. Mash started with his attempt at changing his wood. He told them everything, although he did skip over most of his failures. They didn't need to know about them. It took a few minutes to explain the skills themselves, and the feeling he had when he got them. Once he finished, all heads turned toward Luke. He could apparently see something that the rest of them couldn't. Chapter 274, Soulless. Luke wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't really angry at Mash either. He had just been surprised by the skill. Apparently, he could see more about the creatures that Mash made than he could. He was sweating a little and rubbed at the side of his head. Although that was likely due to the cyclical nature of their conversation thus far. Luke had tried to explain what he saw, what had set him off so dramatically, and failed. Luke was too stunned to speak with sense, which forced them to rehash the same question multiple times. What do you mean by a bland soul? Mash's voice held a little irritation. Luke had said that the soul he could see within the dragon was empty, blank, and now bland. None of that meant anything to Mash or the others. Thus, he repeated his question for the third time now. Stop. Don't just answer stupidly. It was a rare occurrence when Red snapped at someone. She seemed thoroughly annoyed at the back and forth that Mash and Luke had been having. That was fair. Luke paused and took a deep breath. He let it out slowly, then took one more before starting. Sorry, I was still panicking a little. Mash's skill seems to make living beings. The dragon over there has a soul, but it's not like ours. Our souls fill our bodies completely and are colorful, unique. No two souls are exactly the same. The shape, color, and purity are all different. Mash's, for example, is messy, it has a bunch of colors and constantly shifts. There is no consistency in his soul. Red, yours, on the other hand, is a mix of red and black. It acts almost like a liquid that has filled your body. Jill's looks like it's made of yarn, and the color is a pure dark purple. Mine is gold, pure, and it extends beyond my physical body. Luke took another breath and finally seemed to calm down. For his part, Mash had some time to consider what Luke meant. It seemed like Luke can get a lot of information from someone's soul. He should probably learn how to read people's abilities from their souls. That would be a welcome improvement. None of them had any good ways of discerning their opponent's abilities, and this sounded like it could work. That thing's soul is empty. It has no shape or form either. It barely even fills the creature too. Its soul feels fake, artificial. Luke wasn't done speaking, but Jill interjected. Wait, does that mean? Is his creation alive? Luke shook his head and explained. It is alive, but like halfway. Imagine a complex golem or summoning, but with more life. It's probably like that. The problem is that what he's doing is dangerously close to necromancy. I've seen undead before, and this. Luke's words ended, and he shivered at the mention of necromancy. The unsaid words were known by everyone, but Mash didn't really care. Honestly, hearing that they were similar to undead was a huge relief. It made him more comfortable with using them. Undead were ultimately mindless creations. That wasn't the right word for it, but he couldn't think of anything better. There was some undead with the capacity to think, but they lacked things like emotion. They didn't have desires other than slaughter as far as he knew. If Mash's creations were like that, then it wouldn't weigh on his conscience. His shoulders sagged as relief washed over him. That didn't go unnoticed by anyone. Your creations are like the undead, but not the exact same. I don't know what you should do with them, but you should decide now. Luke was being stern. He seemed to put a lot of importance on the skill, or rather on Mash to make a firm decision. Jill and Red both nodded along. Red added her own suggestion as well. I think you should just treat them as advanced golems for now. You can probably change the skill later to make it like that. Mash shared the opinion but was surprised to hear the confidence she had in him. She seemed to fully believe that his skills would continue to change and that he would have some control over them. 51 made it sound like a near impossible task, and the others still hadn't managed it. Despite all of that, Mash agreed with the Red. He would probably be able to alter the skill again in the future. Even still, there was something he wanted to test before coming to a decision. Wait, I want to test my skills on it. Mash said the words as he summoned the dragon to him. It listened to his command, and it walked over to him slowly. The creation couldn't feel pain. Priscilla had coerced Mash into adding that. She suggested that it was mandatory and that she herself couldn't really feel pain. Mash hesitated only slightly but acknowledged the advice. His own skills prevented a lot of the pain he felt, and he often considered if he could remove his own sensation. Oddly, Priscilla told him not to do that. Well, he could always change it later. He slowly reached out and tore off a piece of the wood on his creation. It started slowly regrowing as soon as he did. The draconic creation didn't acknowledge him in the slightest. It didn't even notice him tear out the chunk of wood. Mash looked at the piece of wood in his palm. It was rough. Well, actually it was just a piece of bark. There was little special about it now. Mash grimaced and stuffed the small piece into his mouth. He didn't really want to use any extra energy, and he could eat it easily enough. The wood crunched as he chewed it. The result was somewhat expected. That being that he ate a piece of wood. It didn't raise his stats or help him recover any energy. It was that moment when he accepted that his creatures weren't truly alive. They were at best some kind of hybrid. Probably closer to undead like Luke had suggested. Honestly, Mash thought that even the undead would work for his skills, so his creations might even be more like a golem. His relief was palpable, and they returned to the training arena after talking some more. Mash shared his experience, and how he managed to upgrade his skill with the others. He tried to give them all of the details. He didn't know if they could replicate it, but it was better than nothing. After the discussion, Mash had recovered enough to open a portal back. The arena was much as they had left it. All four of them entered, but he left the dragon behind. He ordered it to just stick near the large tree and fly around. It would be a test too. He wanted to make sure that it would listen to his commands indefinitely. Plus, it would be a good way to test if it decayed or not. Previously, he would need to rely on the special wood granted by his tree and form to make self-sustaining imitations, but he felt like this was a step up from that. Mash saw the others in the arena. 51 was just standing around, and the two foreigners were working on their own thing. Every head turned as they returned. Mash wondered why 51 wasn't bothering the others like he did with them. It was strange, but he didn't worry about it. Instead, he just waved toward 51. Hey, I'm back. Do you have any more food? Mash could have easily made his own meal, but the food that 51 had brought out earlier had been good. He wanted to get some more of it if he could. The masked man nodded briefly and opened his storage space. He began setting some food out, but Mash could tell that he was just waiting for an opportunity to talk. Mash walked over as 51 finished setting out the food. When he got closer, 51 spoke. His voice was eager, curious to the point that he abandoned his annoying pretentiousness. Did you really do it? It was a little startling to hear the man sound normal. Mash paused as he realized that most of the man's attitude thus far had been an act. Why? Mash decided to just ignore it and answered simply. Yup, 2 skills in fact. 51 had been looking for the table, but his head snapped up fast when Mash spoke. Mash wished that the man wasn't wearing a mask. He bet that the man had quite the expression on his face, but the mask spoiled the moment of surprise. Still, Mash took some satisfaction in the way the man froze up. Mash pushed back one of the chairs at the table and sat down while he processed the information. His friends were taking their own seats at the partially readied table. After a few seconds, 51 seemed to shake himself out of his surprise and he finished setting the table in a few seconds. Mash would have offered to help, but the food was in his storage space, and it was widely considered rude to enter someone else's storage space. The two foreigners had walked over as well, and the southerner spoke. His accent was thick, but Mash could feel the contempt behind his words. "You expect us to simply trust your word?" The man was still trying to act haughty despite failing where Mash had succeeded. His poorly kept jealousy was written plain on his face. Mash was smarter than to defend himself pointlessly. 51 seemed to trust what Mash had said and that was enough. Instead, Mash chose to do something far more smug. He smirked wickedly and tilted his chin up slightly as he looked at the foreigner. It worked. The man's face remained somewhat calm, but his eyes burned with hatred. Mash was goading him a bit, but that reaction seemed a little extreme. They were saved from a confrontation as Timur, the northerner, asked a question. "Do you have any ideas about what to do?" He repeated the words Mash had said earlier. Timur was a much friendlier person than the still unnamed southerner, and Mash was glad to engage with him. While he knew that his advice would be heard by both, he didn't really care. Mash didn't like the southerner, but he didn't really care about sharing his advice. It kind of felt like he was bragging, and he liked the feeling. So, he repeated his explanation again. He had told his friends of his experience. How he felt that moment of inspiration and had felt like he could push his skills further. That moment had pushed him, and he had lost track of everything as he worked on his skill. He didn't have more advice to give, but it seemed like his words were enough. Timur nodded graciously, and Mash noticed the southerner's expression change a little as he listened. Then 51 finally seemed ready to re-engage with the group. He had been oddly silent, but now he joined Mash in his explanation. He returned to his earlier attitude and bragged openly, as he explained the experience himself. 51 claimed that he had experienced something similar dozens of times and bragged about how much he had managed to upgrade. He didn't go into the specifics of his skills, and neither did Mash for that matter. They did explain what they could though. Chapter 275, Epiphany. Red P.O.V. Red was thoroughly annoyed long before Mash had managed to succeed. She knew her skills in class, and she highly doubted that this kind of trial would work for her. A product of her family's grooming meant that their classes were already highly specialized. She had known a little about what 51 had said already, and even a little more too. This process of evolving skills would create more narrow and specific classes. Contrary to what most people believed, a highly specialized class was far stronger than one that could do everything. Then she remembered Mash and amended her thought. In most cases, a specialized class was stronger, but there were always some exceptions. She knew that her friends were good people, but she couldn't help but be a little envious of their situations. Mash and Luke especially. For all Mash was demonized, he was able to do so much with his class. He was powerful, strong enough that his race mattered little to most. Luke was another monster in his own right. While he probably wasn't as strong as Mash, his class had even more significance. Yes, she was jealous. Her class was a mockery, a callous reminder of the mistakes she had made. It was a consequence of her own weakness. She pushed the negative thoughts down and moved her focus back to the task at hand. Her class wasn't weak. In fact, it was probably one of the deadliest classes someone at her level could get. Although it was hard to figure out what she could change easily. She had spent the first several hours trying each of her skills a little. She didn't know how Mash knew which skills to pick, but she didn't have the same insight. Thus, she had spent the first few hours just going through her skills one at a time. She didn't really know what she was doing either. The thing Mash had going for him, was the fact that he had done this before. She wasn't so lucky or talented. The skill she thought she could change was her perfect bloody clothing. It wasn't that the skill wasn't specific, and the perfect in the name implied that it was complete. However, she wanted it to be more than just simple clothing. She could change the shape or reinforce it with another skill, but it didn't really protect her naturally. It was flimsy, and she wanted it to be more like an armor. She had tried a few things already. It was easy to manipulate the shape, so she had changed into a set of plate armor. The skill let her manipulate its appearance perfectly, and it even changed color and texture to match what she had in mind. The texture was the strangest thing. It was still blood regardless of how it felt. It was hard to reconcile the cold metal on her skin with the knowledge that it was just blood. Her skills gave her a connection to all blood, but the chill that she felt on her body was too real. There wasn't much else she felt like she could do. How did she actually change the skill? Appearance alone was obviously not enough, but it wasn't like she could actually turn it to metal. What if she layered it like Mash did with his skill? It was a thought, and one that took all of a few seconds to accomplish. It didn't work. It wasn't exactly unexpected though. If it was as simple as replicating another's tricks, then everyone would have evolved their skills. What was the point of all this? It wasn't like upgrading her skill would change anything. Her class was what it was, and she didn't even really want armor. The protection might be nice, but it would be mostly worthless in most situations. Her blood body made most traditional forms of protection completely worthless. She let the armor dissipate and returned to being simple clothing. As the armor broke down, her helm vanished too. As the faceplate slowly melted away, she caught sight of Mash from the corner of her eyes. A sharp prod of envy filled her as she saw him sleeping in one of the corners. He had finished the test and just rested now. 51 had implied that Mash could go on to the next test if he wanted to, but he said he would wait for her. Well, everyone in the group, but he believed that they would all succeed. It annoyed her. It wasn't just envy and jealousy either. His faith in them reminded her eerily of the expectations of her family. The way they silently forced her to try her hardest when she didn't even care about the subject. That had been one of the many reasons she had left her family, and now she was feeling it again. Her thoughts were like venom. They slowly filtered into her mind and exasperated her petty envy. Mash was just sleeping, and Red knew that her anger was unjustified. It was the childish response of someone who had a bad relationship with their family. Her pettiness made her feel pathetic, and she turned away in frustration. She didn't hate Mash. No, her friends meant a lot to her. That realization only made her feel more self-loathing. She felt a slight but familiar rush of energy and grimaced. She just leveled up. Mash P.O.V. The test had finally reached its end. Mash was well past bored at this point. He had tested his new skills a little, but they weren't really all that complex. He had seen golems before and this wasn't all that different. Instead of using his time on that, he slept while using his hibernation skill. Despite the name of the skill, he had never actually tried that before. There was a small hope that it would upgrade the skill. The skill didn't change, but he did feel like it was one of the most restful periods of sleep ever. He had to be woken by Priscilla, which in itself was rare. Normally, his body would automatically wake him after 1 or 2 hours of sleep. According to Priscilla, she thought that he could have slept indefinitely if he wanted to. The healing effects of the skill were restoring his body while he was asleep. It would even deal with things like thirst and hunger. He could truly hibernate like an animal, and sleep for months at a time. Although that wasn't something he really cared for. Mash stretched his arms, as he looked over the others. The Southerner was noticeably missing from the group. He had apparently passed the test already and had moved on to the next test. It seemed like 51 didn't need to observe. The only other person to pass the test was Red. Although she did by leveling. Mash had no idea how she had managed that, but she hadn't talked about it either. He didn't press her for information either. One look in her eyes made him feel like she was depressed about something. He didn't know everything about her class, but he just nodded and let the matter drop. 51 had some way to know that they were telling the truth, and trusted them. Currently, they were just waiting for him to send Timur off. He said that all 4 of them could proceed even though only Red and he had succeeded. Apparently, he would have let them go the next test, even if he was the only one to succeed. Mash stood close enough to the others and heard what 51 was saying. Timur, I am sorry to say that you have failed the test. Thank you for trying, but I cannot let you proceed. Timur didn't look offended or even bothered by the news. He spoke with a frankness that Mash liked. I am not talented. I didn't expect to pass. My levels came from the monsters that surround my city. I have tried, but I am nothing more than a fighter. He didn't sound the least bit dejected as he spoke. He seemed glad to learn of something new and was satisfied with his attempt. His failure really didn't seem to matter to him. Mash could get that. Whether he passed all of the tests or not, he wouldn't join this organization. It was useful to gain some information, but he didn't really want anything else from them. Nor did he want to feel obligated to do any work or the like. He had done that already and hated it. There's nothing wrong with simple Jill shouted the words like a chant, and Timur smiled a little at it. Mash didn't let Timur leave just like that though. He thought that they could be friends, and the mention of monsters interested him. Wait, take one of these. I can visit your home and help out with the monsters. Timur stared at the proffered sculpture. It was an imitation of Priscilla. With the changes to his skill, the creations were able to form even stronger connections to Priscilla. Not to mention that they formed a similar connection to him too. He would know where it was regardless of distance, and he was fairly certain he could communicate through it as he did with Priscilla's real bodies. As the realization hit him, he made a few more and handed them to each of his friends. We can talk to one another through them. Mash explained to everyone involved including his friends. In the past, they had used the imitations for location, but now they could use it for communication too. The imitations of Priscilla were especially intelligent and could handle complex things like sending messages. He probably should have tested before this very instant, but he wasn't the best at remembering the niche things. Although, he would be sure to test more of his creations later. If only to see how complete the creation skills were, and if they could mimic his abilities fully or not. Thank you. Do come, although there is nothing to do other than fight. Timur didn't sound all that grateful, but he acted it. Mash grinned broadly, showing his teeth as he spoke. That is exactly what I'm hoping for. Those were words that Mash loved to hear. He wanted to fight monsters, not worry about all the other stuff that keeps getting thrown his way. This place, these tests, and even the information all felt like a hassle. He was tempted to ask Timur if they could just join him, but he held his tongue. Information was too valuable to ignore, and he didn't think that the others wanted to leave. They seemed curious about the next test and kept glancing toward 51. Mash was curious too, but he didn't want to sit through another test like this. Timur left shortly after saying his piece. The way he disappeared was interesting though. 51 had pulled out a small knife from his storage. He walked over to one of the many doors in the building and thrust the knife into the door. The door didn't splinter or resist the blade. The blade seemed to part the wood without actually damaging it. Mash didn't get how that worked, and he understood even less as 51 pushed open the door. It opened to a snowy landscape. In the distance Mash could barely make out some lights. He heard Timur sigh beside him. Home. It was a single word, but it obviously meant a lot to him. Mash wanted to follow him. The landscape was covered in snow, and he didn't see any trees either. Interestingly, he saw no mountains too. Timur's people were known to live by mountains. Mash was about to ask Timur about it, but 51 closed the door as soon as Timur had stepped through. He grabbed his sides and exaggerated a shiver. Now that is cold. Well, let's get on to the next test. Chapter 276, Simple Fighting. 51 briefly explained the next test. It wasn't particularly complicated though. They would summon monsters, and they would need to defeat them. It was a simple enough trial. None of them were really all that worried about it. Mash fully believed that any one of them could handle whatever monsters were summoned for this trial. It got to the point where they decided to flip a coin to see who got to fight. This doesn't make any sense, there are 4 of us. Red had a flat gaze as she spoke to Jill. Jill shook her head quickly and pulled out 4 coins from her pockets. Mash blinked in surprise. It wasn't that the gesture was uncommon, but he didn't expect her to carry coins around. Mash didn't carry anything with him. Everything he had was in his storage space unless he needed it. So, the very typical gesture caught him off guard. Here. We all flip and anyone that gets crowns wins. Mash instantly understood her idea and nodded. The gold coins had a crown on one side and a tiara on the other. It was supposed to represent the king and queen. Not the individuals but the station. He was about to flip the coin. No, wait. Let's all do it together. 3. 2. Jill was having too much fun with this, but Mash couldn't help but smile himself. He moved the coin so that it rested on his thumb and against his pointer finger. A single coin felt so light with all of his strength. It might as well have been a feather. 1. Mash was a little surprised as Jill rushed her countdown, and he flipped his coin slightly delayed. It didn't matter. Every coin flew high into the air. The sound of metal striking metal was audible as his coin hit the ceiling. It echoed in the silent room. Mash had put way too much force behind that flip. Although that only helped his toss, since the coin bounced off and came down a little faster than the others. Red and Luke flipped their coins normally, though Jill had put some extra power behind her toss too. Not nearly as much as he had, but enough that hers was the last coin to fall. Red and Luke caught theirs easily, but Mash had to dash to the side to catch his coin. He caught the coin in his left hand and quickly slammed it over the back of his other hand. It was a common way to play this game as it hid the results. Mash looked over and saw that neither Red nor Luke had done the same. They both had the coins open to the world. Mash could see that both of them had lost. That meant that the final decision would come down to him or Jill. They might all fail, but that wasn't all that likely. Once Jill caught her coin, she didn't flip it like Mash had but just covered it with her other hand. "Mash, did you cheat?" He was a little surprised to get the accusation from Luke of all people. It took him a moment to respond. "No, it's just how I always did it. I can flip it back though. I didn't really look at which side I got." Luke shook his head quickly. "No, if you didn't look it doesn't really matter. I didn't know that people did that." "What did you get?" Jill spoke while revealing her own hand. A golden crown pointed upward. Mash slowly moved his own hand away and was disappointed to be met with a tiara. That was it, Jill had won. 51 stared at the whole display with obvious confusion. He didn't stop them though and let them play their games. Jill walked forward to enter the arena. They had changed rooms but hadn't moved up the tower. Instead, they just went to another arena that looked identical to the first. Although it was on the other end of the building. There were 3 such rooms, and the Southerner was still taking the test in one of the rooms. 51 stuck around for the test, and Mash wondered why he had left the Southerner alone. Maybe another member was watching him? It wasn't really important, and Mash refocused as Jill teleported into the arena. He watched her and remembered something. "I think Jill conned us." Mash said the words and didn't hide his incredulity. She had the skill to win games like that, didn't she? Plus, she could kind of see into the future. A coin flip game was a terrible competition to have. He shared these ideas with the others but did through mental messages. He didn't want to talk about Jill's skills openly. Mash looked aghast, but the other 2 didn't seem to care at all. In fact, Red nodded as she knew already. Luke just shrugged like it didn't really matter. Red commented about him being a battle junkie. Mash was left grumbling to himself, but he didn't argue. He liked fighting, especially when there were no consequences. Jill P.O.V. Jill teleported into the arena. Moving from the smooth stone to rough dirt was a little odd. The dirt was uneven, and she wasn't heavy enough to properly stomp it flat. She could do it now, but it would look awkward and ruin the moment. She had a mad grin on her face as she heard Mash's faint shouts from behind. He had just realized the trick. She was just glad that she had convinced Red to play along. It turned out that her skill, chosen by the universe, had improved her luck significantly. She hadn't expected it to, but in games of true chance she basically never lost. Only Red knew that it would, but she wasn't as addicted to combat as Jill. Well, Red didn't like to admit that she was, and that let Jill use her for this. Mash had been asleep when 51 told the foreigner about the trial, but she had heard. That had given her enough time to work out this plan. Plus, she had given up on the first test entirely. Her skills were fine, and she was already leveling quickly. Figuring out either thing would be a later problem, and one she didn't think was important. She was mainly here because the others wanted to learn what 51 had to share. She didn't care about it one bit. They had figured out a lot on their own, and she kind of felt like adventurers were supposed to do that. Her thoughts froze as the test obviously started up. Golems, or rather elemental golems, started forming in the room. 8 of them, and she was surprised to see them range so many elements. At the opposite end of the room, she saw molten rock climb from the dirt. Lave splashed on the ground as an enormous obsidian fist climbed out. She wondered where it was climbing from. Summoning skills were varied enough that she didn't know how they actually summoned things. Was it like her space magic? She knew that some summoners could teleport. She turned from the 2 fire golems. Giant crystals sprang out of the ground like grass. They wrapped together and connected. 2 crystal, or maybe diamond golems seemed to phase into existence. Their arrival was distinctly different from the previous. Another 2 were made of ice, and she had missed their arrival. But she caught the tail end of one of them. Its arm seemed to form from its body. The air seemed to crystallize into the shape of an arm. This creature didn't have any fingers, and now that she looked, the diamond one didn't either. Only the lava one had fully functional arms. She glanced at the final pair of golems. They were odd. Two metal spheres floated in the air, and lightning bounced around them in a circular kind of way. She really didn't know what to think of the arrangement of golems, but she felt a distinct urge to blow them all up. She could make a barrier of space near the golems and threw her spear. That would probably be able to deal with them all. However, controlling that so she wouldn't get hurt would be annoying. Plus, she was fairly certain the building wouldn't withstand that either. Those were the sensible thoughts she had. They were not the ones she chose. One of the crystal ones held out its arm. It didn't have fingers but a kind of weird obelisk in place of an arm. When it raised the limb, she was surprised to realize it was hollow on the inside. An opening was there too. Her forewarning let her dodge the beam of light that shot from the crystal. It had a fairly long charge up, and she teleported to the side as its arm filled with white light. Even with it, her dodge was narrow. The light was fast. That attack changed her attitude. She blinked again and appeared further to the right. The crystal golems could fire beams of light. That was terrifying, but they were slow, and the beams took a while to charge up. It would be problematic if she didn't have her forewarning. She expected the lightning ones were similar. The arrangement of the golems made more sense to her now. The fire golems were in the middle. The crystal and lightning golems were to either side. The ice ones were as far away from the fire as possible but were still on that end of the arena. None of them had appeared near the spectator area where the others were. After confirming their positions, she estimated their size. Each golem was 2 or 3 times her own height. That wasn't too big. She looked at the diamond golems and willed the space around their arms to harden. It did so, and the slow-moving golems were locked in place. It was easy. Brute strength probably couldn't break her barriers, and she doubted they could fire light out of anything but those tubes. A smile slowly started forming on Jill's face, as her needle coalesced out of the space around her hand. She teleported again and immediately started falling toward the diamond golems. The lightning golem fired at her previous location. The sound made the very air shake. That felt like real thunder, whereas Mash's attacks tended to feel more magical. The two lightning golems had actually spun together. They formed a large circle before firing the bolt of lightning. Her forewarning let her close her eyes and let her avoid getting blinded by the attack. The barriers she had made weren't that big. She had essentially made shackles for the crystal golem. That probably wouldn't damage the walls, plus 51's group could fix it. She felt like a group like this would have more than enough to spare. She threw her javelin downward. It moved unnaturally fast as it split the space in front of it. She was really grateful for the advice Red had given her. The spear cut the space in front of it, and the universe then pushed the rest of the weapon onward as it tried to fill the space. To everyone else, it probably just looked like she had thrown it really hard. She did do that, but there was more behind the weapon than her raw strength. She turned away and teleported all the way across the room. She did that long before her weapon had actually struck the barrier. The fire golem was too slow to adjust to her movements, and the ice golem was stuck unable to get closer to the fire one. The choice of golems was rather terrible, even if they were positioned well. She landed on the ground and stared at the diamond golem. Her weapon, the legendary weapon, struck the shackle on the right golem's arm, and she felt the world shudder for a second time. Chapter 277, Such Devastation. Jill's P.O.V. Jill tried to see what happened. It was a little too fast for her eyes, but her forewarning let her get a glimpse. This time the explosion was like the first. The one that had almost killed her back in Mash's world. Why did it happen again? The last explosion wasn't nearly as bad. That was the last thought that went through her head. All rational thought vanished when she felt the pull. The tug of the universe as it fixed the damage her attack had caused. The pull was strong. Strong enough that she wondered if it would pull her skin off. Her foresight hadn't seen that result though, but she couldn't relax with the vision. Her body remained stiff, as the pull shifted to a push. Existence itself pushed outward, and space rippled. She remembered the last time this had happened. The ripple had force behind it. It was true the force dissipated quickly, but that didn't make her any less terrified. Even if she knew that the ripple wouldn't kill her, she tried to raise her arms to block it. She wasn't fast enough to beat space, and the ripple struck her. It tore her apart. It felt like her body had been ripped in half, but then the feeling was gone. The brief sensation was so horrible and quick, that her mind began rejecting it. The lingering pain in her abdomen opposed her mind though. Then she fell on her hands and knees and vomited. It took several seconds for her to readjust. When she did, she was able to see a much more devastating sight. That was the only way to describe her attack. It was devastating. The building around her attack was gone. Her eyes darted between the edges, and she could just barely make out a perfectly spherical outline. The dirt was disturbed, and the walls had other cracks too, but the real attack had formed a near-perfect sphere. This was it. Even a god couldn't resist something like that. How could anything survive being erased? She unconsciously closed one eye, and everything went dark. She had closed her good eye. Luke had done all he could, but even he couldn't bring back her other eye. The eye itself was there, but she couldn't see from it. Her eyes had depicted space. They made it seem like she was spying on the stars. One of her eyes was devoid of stars now, and Luke couldn't bring them back. It hung as a reminder of the being that had tortured her for nothing. Jill felt a smile creeping onto her face. She really did it. She had something that could harm a god. As if in confirmation, she felt the rush of a level up. Mash p.o.v. Mash watched as Jill threw her weapon down at one of the golems. The golem didn't even bother trying to dodge. It seemed like it had given up after Jill's first dodge. Mash had been a little surprised by the beam of light, but it was just heat, right? That didn't seem all that dangerous. The lightning on the other hand was impressive. It was really lightning, unlike his magical variant. That didn't mean that it was any stronger though. Although, it was a little faster, but for things moving that fast it was hard to notice. Mash's eyes traced the falling javelin. He watched as it struck something. It had been moving quickly, but he noticed it stop slightly before hitting the golem itself. A quarter of a second was all he would have needed to realize what was coming. He didn't have that time, and he saw the golem warp. It wasn't just the golem either. Everything around it seemed to vanish for a second, and Mash couldn't see Jill's weapon anymore. It seemed like reality was swallowing itself. The effect only lasted an instant but pulled on everything in the room. The things closest were simply disappearing. Even the light was being swallowed. Mash resisted the pull, but it wasn't as easy as he would have liked. It felt like something had gripped all the hairs on his body and was pulling him forward. The instant passed. That was when the explosion came. After the tug came to the wave. The space bent wildly around where Jill's weapon had struck. He could have sworn he heard something bend or break. A ripple pulsed from the impact. Unlike water, it didn't travel horizontally. It rippled in every direction at once. Mash couldn't dodge or even defend against the effect as it rolled toward him. It struck and bent everything in his body. Then it fixed itself. The whole thing had probably only lasted a second, but Mash shivered. The ripple had hurt. It felt like his whole body had broken and then put itself back together. The pain lingered within him. This was worse than when he had run miles as a kid. He let out a groan, but it was nothing compared to the breaking noise that he still heard. It rang in his ears as his body tried to adjust to what was happening. Priscilla was helping a lot with that, but he didn't thank her. He couldn't really think straight. He just stared at the arena, at the golems. Or rather the place where the golems had been. 7 golems were gone, and the last was missing half its body. It was made of ice, and it lay on its side unmoving. The wall nearest to the golems had a hole in it. He got a nice view of the basement as Jill's attack had taken most of the floor with it. Mash hadn't even noticed a lower floor before. Mash just stared at the space and shivered again. Okay, maybe he wasn't durable enough to survive that. He remembered that distinct moment when he saw true nothingness. Or was it when he didn't see anything? That brief instant where Jill had erased everything. It was horrifying, and he could understand why the people back home were so anxious. Just what did it mean to be a god killer? The surprise and awe were wearing off now, and there was someone he could ask that question to. Plus, he wanted to yell at Jill for being thoughtless. He wasn't alone in that either. Anger radiated off of Red. Her aura made it easy to read even without his domain. Luke seemed more concerned than angry, and 51 just stared. He still wore his mask, but Mash saw how frozen the rest of his body was. He was still surprised. Mash glanced toward Jill and leaped from the viewing area. Like the previous room, it was a slightly elevated platform. His jump would take him right to her, and he grew more concerned too. She wasn't standing. Rather she had fallen to her knees and was just staring toward her attack. He couldn't see her face, and couldn't help but remember the last time. Not the small explosion in the arena, but the world-shaking one that had done just that. He remembered the damage, the devastation, and this was similar. His jump carried him a bit further than he intended, and he landed in front of Jill. He turned quickly and all of his words froze. Jill was smiling. That alone would be worrisome, but she was also crying. Tears streamed from her face and landed on her clothes. She didn't wear anything fancy. She had a thin leather breastplate over a simple shirt and pants. The shirt had a high collar though and it was clinging to her neck. The tears were soaking it. Her eyes were closed too, and his domain was giving him mixed emotions. He was at a loss for words. What did someone do in a situation like this? He decided that saying anything would be a mistake. The only thing that came to mind was nothing. So, he said exactly that. Instead, he walked over to her and sat down beside her. Either Luke or Red had noticed his own actions, and they slowed. Red didn't yell, and Luke just continued to look concerned. They didn't stop but walked over and sat down beside Jill as well. Should I look through her thoughts? I believe I can help as I did for you. No. Priscilla had good intentions, but that was definitely not the right thing to do. It worked for him, because of his special relationship with Priscilla. He didn't think Jill would enjoy the process either. No, he stopped her from doing anything. The only thing they did was sit. Silence stretched on. Even 51 had known better than to bother them. Either that or he was still stunned by the damage to his building. Mash didn't know how much time had passed but eventually, Jill stopped crying. She didn't wipe her eyes or anything. The tears just simply ended, or maybe they ran out. He didn't know how long they sat there. Finally, he decided to break the silence. If for nothing else than to give Jill some water. He opened his storage space and pulled out some water. He could make water out of magic, but it wasn't as good as the fresh stuff, and he still had a barrel or two. He didn't enter his storage. He still had another duplicate in there and he willed it to get some water. It was one of his old creations, and he could tell that it was somehow less than the ones he could make now. Mash ignored that for now and pushed the glass toward Jill while speaking. Are you okay? Do you want some water? Mash broke the silence, and Jill opened her eyes. Mash stared into the mismatched eyes and felt like her gaze was oddly empty. It wasn't the missing stars from one of her eyes. It simply felt like there was less life in them. Jill almost seemed to hesitate, but she took the cup of water and drank from it. She did it slowly and none of them rushed her. They had all had their problems and needed time to recover. Mash remembered the days he spent going through his memories, but that didn't mean he could understand what Jill was thinking. I did it. That attack. It can hurt a god. I did it. Her voice was broken. She wasn't crying or smiling anymore. Although she seemed to struggle for every word. Mash heard people say that they needed to force the words out, but now he felt like he was seeing it firsthand. Why I'm not happy? Why did I level? The questions weren't actually meant for them. They were directed at nothing, but Red interjected despite it. Because the world sucks. Nothing we can do but keep going and hope it gets better. Red rarely spoke like that, but the words couldn't have been said any other way. That was the truth, and not just for Jill. Mash nodded along unconsciously. There was nothing he could say to argue with that. That thought was already burned into his mind. It was basically the same idea that Priscilla had presented before. Although she had done it, by letting him know of her expectations of him. He felt like he should share that. You remember when I froze up after the stuff with the elders? When it felt like everything I did was horrible. Priscilla helped me get through it. She reminded me that I still had a future. The past would always be the past. The words felt weird coming from his mouth. He hadn't shared the more personal details with the other, but he thought that all three of them could benefit from it now. So, he didn't let himself stop with just that. He continued to share, abbreviating what Priscilla had said and shown him. Chapter 278, done. Some life returned to Jill's eyes. She wasn't magically happy, but she didn't seem as lost as before. They had been adventurers for a short time. They were more than friends, but less in some respects too. Mash once thought they were more like a family, but that wasn't quite right either. They were bonded together by fate, but they didn't talk like he thought real friends would. He didn't share with them like he did with his brother and sister, although he felt like he relied on them more. There was so much weird about their relationship. It was a product of their circumstance and compatibility. They had all been excluded or desperate for one reason or another, and maybe it was an inevitability that they met and formed a group. Mash saw how unusual their relationship really was. At times they were closer than friends or family, but other times they could feel like strangers. He wanted to change that. He felt like he needed to. That was why he felt compelled to share his experience. To share Priscilla's words with them. It was one of the things he kept closest to him. The moment might not be important to them or even to Priscilla, but it had done a lot for him. It got him to look forward more, to not glance backward as often. The words had made him feel like he didn't need to run from anything. His past didn't chase him. It was always there. It wasn't something to escape from. It's something to carry. He said those words aloud, though he didn't mean to. They had just come out as he thought. He turned to the others. They couldn't know what he was thinking, but they nodded when he met their eyes. It seemed like the words had helped them all, and that was enough for now. Time passed and eventually, 51 came down to speak to them. He had left them alone. Even he had realized that they needed some space. Some time to just sit and talk. Mash was surprised that he had respected that, but he guessed that 51 wasn't actually a bad person. Although, he was annoying at times. Mash's gaze flicked toward the partially damaged building, and he wondered if they would get punished for it. Maybe they would be forced to pay? He didn't know if they could afford it, but it probably wouldn't be too hard to earn the gold. Don't worry about the building. Are you guys good to go to the next test? It's nothing complicated. Just some questions to know if we can trust you or not. It's not personal or difficult, and I believe that all of you can pass easily. Mash looked back at 51 as he took a seat across from them. His back was toward the damaged building. The words sounded surprisingly genuine, and Mash looked toward the others. If they wanted to stop, he would. He felt like he had gained a lot from the experience either way. To his surprise, it was Jill who answered. Yeah, we're ready. Sorry about all that. Also, I leveled, if that mattered still. 51 nodded and paused in the motion. It does. Summoned golems cannot let people level. It would mean you have passed the previous test as well. He stopped talking, took another breath and then spoke again. Well, it matters if you decide to join. It would be used to determine where your group would get placed, but I don't think you care for that. Look, I get it. I know why you don't want to join, and we won't force you. Even before the next trial, I want you to know that I'm rooting for you guys. Not just as prospective members, but because I have seen the kind of people you are. I feel like I can trust you guys. Mash watched as 51's tone seemed to change. It was casual and formal. The two almost seemed to be clashing as he spoke. Although, he barely paid any attention to that as the man raised his right hand to his mask. He grabbed the left side of the mask and pulled it off. The motion was slow, and Mash felt his breath catch when he saw 51's face. His face was covered in small burn scars. There was one large scar. A part of his lip was missing where the scar began. The right side of his upper lip was gone and a burn scar ran along his face. It stretched to his ear and covered most of his cheek too. It was obviously an old scar, but it looked like it hurt even now. Mash didn't ask or comment. If it was something that could be healed, 51 would have done it by now. Luke didn't offer either. My name is Egan. I'm pleased to really meet you. He reached out a hand, and Mash didn't hesitate as he grabbed it. He shook Egan's hand as firmly as he could. The man matched Mash's strength easily. Jill and Luke followed Mash's action and shook Egan's hand too. Only Red hesitated, and then she asked a question as her eyes lit up with recognition. Wait, do you mean you're Egan of the Scorched Lands? Egan let his hand drop back to the ground and nodded slowly. Mash didn't recognize the name, and neither did Jill. Surprisingly, that name seemed to mean something to Luke. Seemed to freeze him in his seat. Even the grey fur on his ears seemed frozen. Although, Mash had never heard of that name. His curiosity was piqued now. Who? The word drifted from Jill, and Mash nodded along eagerly. Head bobbing quickly, he slowed when 51 cleared his throat. I did not think people from your continent would know of. And ask that you do not explain now. It is not a past I wish to relieve. There is one trial left, and I believe you are ready to take the test. The next was a literal test. 51 had unceremoniously handed them each a single sheet of paper. There were only 3 questions on the front of the page. The back was empty. But the questions were important. Even a small glance had told him that these questions weren't going to be easy. Mash's eyes narrowed on the first question as he grabbed an ink pen. Pens were pretty uncommon and expensive. But someone who could afford to a building like this wouldn't care about that cost. He walked over to a nearby wall and slid down, sitting with his back against the wall. The chill provided by the metal walls was nice, and he held up the paper as he considered the first question. What is a monster? Mash stared at the paper and truly considered the question. He only had a pen, so what he wrote down would stick. His initial instinct was to write creatures from dungeons or things like that. Although, that idea died quickly. He thought about all the dungeons he had been in, and most of the things inside were people. Many were humanoids, and even many of the monsters were smart. Some were even like Priscilla. Although, he would still consider her a monster. I believe that classification is correct. However, you would also belong in that group. Her message was unneeded. It wasn't that it was snarky or offensive, rather he agreed wholeheartedly. He had done too much, both to himself and others, to consider himself anything but a monster. And his class called him one. Mash stared at the paper at the question and moved his hand slowly. He wrote the letters slowly, but the words felt like they were appropriate. He would need way more than a page to write his real thoughts. I don't know. A simple answer. A true one too. His eyes drifted down toward the next question. Who do you fight? Mash looked at the question. His hands moved before his mind contemplated the scope of the question. In a second the words were written. But they were not words he would take back. Monsters. The answers he was writing might get him in trouble. Someone with better judgment might change it because it looked like he was making fun of the test. Not Mash. That was the answer that came first. That jumped into his mind with 100% certainty. Monsters didn't just mean the mindless creatures that were destroyed. It didn't mean the beasts he found in dungeons. Monsters were monsters, and everyone knew one when they saw it. Priscilla was a monster. Mash was a monster. That wasn't it though. Leah was a monster. Gerald was a monster. Humans could be monsters. He fought those kinds of monsters. Real monsters. He added real to the front of the word. It didn't really fit, and he wrote it down next to the other word. Wrapping around the word monster. Mash looked at it and thought that it was strangely cool looking. He glanced down at his own clothes. He tended to go with a fairly plain design on most days. A single color with his family crest near his heart. The colors changed and the shirt shifted. His family's emblem moved to the center of his back. And the front contained the two words. They were printed exactly as he wrote them. Mash couldn't stop grinning. There was so much irony in the design. The worse implications didn't escape him either. He was screaming to the world exactly what he was. Mash chuckled a little. Eyes shifted, and he could see the others turn their heads toward him. They were probably confused. And they saw his shirt, which would only add to their confusion. He didn't think about explaining. Just moved on to the final question. Can you be trusted? This question confused him the most. He had noticed it immediately, and it lingered in his mind as he worked on the others. It almost felt like a trick question or something he shouldn't answer. Maybe he should just write yes down. No, that was a bad idea and would make all of his answers seem more like a joke than they already were. In the end, 51, Oregon, was a friend. And this test was already looking like an insult to Mash. The thing he just did with the shirt wouldn't help either. Mash decided to start writing. Let his mind write the answer as he did with the previous one. It felt more genuine that way. Yes. Although I would give away any secret to help some or something I wanted to. I can't promise to keep any secrets unless they were personal. So, I would trust myself. Because you know that I will use what you give me to help others or myself. Although that second part is kind of obvious. Rambling on and on, Mash kept writing until he felt like he made a mistake. These were his true thoughts, but that didn't mean he should write so literally. Well, it was done, and the pen made it so that he couldn't change it. Or at least, he would feel extremely embarrassed to scribble over his previous answer. He weighed his embarrassment over the two options and decided to just leave his answers as they were. It probably wouldn't get him in trouble. Chapter 279, Average Secrets. Mash sat with Egan and the others after the test. There weren't any tables set out, but Egan did give everyone some strange fruity drink. It was oddly purple and made his tongue feel a little weird as he drank it. They didn't sit in silence, and Luke had asked about his shirt. Nobody commented on the test answers yet though, and that question would lead them there. That didn't stop Mash, and he told Luke the truth. He was also loud enough that the others could hear. It opened the conversation up, and they began discussing the test more openly. They talked about their answers. Mash had to explain some of his reasoning, but the nodded once he kind of explained his thoughts. They all had similar answers if written in odd ways. Red and Luke had written down what he had initially wanted for the first question. But it felt like they had just gone for a straightforward answer. Jill's answers were a little different, but they weren't unexpected. For the first, she had described that god thing that had tortured her, and she had just drawn an arrow pointing upward for the second question. Jill's hatred for that monster was complete. She had explained what had happened to her, although Mash couldn't actually imagine it. Mash and Jill had answered genuinely even if they were odd. On the other hand, Red and Luke felt like they wrote the correct answers. Not in that anyone could be wrong, but just that they did what was expected of them. It didn't seem to matter to Egan. He spoke, butting his way into the conversation rather than letting them drag on. You will have time to talk later. We should move on to some of the more important information. Nothing I tell you will be any major secret, but I believe that some of the information will come as a surprise to you all. Egan's way of speaking still felt odd to Mash. It felt like he was shifting between two different people. The annoying and pompous 51 and the more casual Egan that sat before them now collided as he spoke. Not something to comment on. Levels predate the class system. It is also known that it was a choice at one point. Not all people would level, some would reject it. The same was true of the class system. The current world owner isn't the creator of either, though they had changed it. Made it so then everyone got a class and levels. Egan continued, and his words changed. They felt less like a statement of fact. Slowly, the information turned into something like a story. Egan spoke of a time when the world was imbalanced. When only a handful of individuals had classes or levels. The tale was unbelievable. Mash couldn't even imagine what that would be like. Egan talked about how the current world was just based on the old one. Kings were kings because of their class and little else. Even now a person would need a class to have the position. None of it made any sense, and Mash had a thought wiggle its way into his mind. How old are you? I mean, were you alive back then? It had taken him a while to understand his thoughts. His question came out the moment it clicked. Egan talked about the world like he had lived in it. There was no way, right? The man hadn't been smiling as he told the story. But that changed with Mash's question. Egan tried to give Mash a smile, although a strained one. One that gave him an answer without any words. Everyone went silent at the realization. It lingered for a while, even after Egan said his goodbyes and left. He told them that they were free to explore the city if they wanted and told them that they couldn't enter the higher floor of the towers. None of them bothered exploring the city. They just sat and watched Egan as he left the room. It took a while for them to process the story. It wasn't the secret they had been expecting, but it was well worth the investment. The information wouldn't make them stronger or anything. But it was important. More important than something that just gave them power. Mash's understanding of the world had changed again. He didn't know if it changed anything, but he thought that it should. At the very least it had affected what he thought about the world owner. He had assumed that all world owners were these all-powerful beings. That they were the strongest in the world. Egan's story told otherwise. The current world owner had replaced the previous. Mash imagined that there was only one way to do that. No. He consciously stopped that line of thinking. And he didn't let that assumption remain. He had made more than a few stupid assumptions and stopped himself. Maybe, the previous world owner had left, or relinquished their position. Maybe they just lost their position. Egan's tale would imply that he lived through more than one world owner, and that was enough for him. It probably meant that the world owner wasn't the strongest or oldest. It was just a position and one that could be taken or lost. Again, that changed what he thought of the still mysterious world owner. Mash wanted to meet them, but this organization didn't seem like it would actually do it. Egan had said that they supported the world owner, not that they knew them. They knew of the person and some of their exploits. But that was the extent of their relationship. According to Egan, this group acted for the betterment of the world as a whole. Their group just believed that the current world owner acted in their best interests as well. Mash wasn't so certain about that. But that uncertainty only made him desire a meeting. What he wouldn't give to know what it meant to be a world owner. He owned a world, but he didn't think he qualified as a proper world owner. Then he paused and reconsidered that thought. If a world owner wasn't decided by power or age, what made someone a world owner? Why wouldn't he be considered one? Those questions had some rather heavy implications, and he got the sudden urge to check on his world. He was the owner, regardless of whether he was like the others. And he had been neglecting his world, only using it to escape from his own problems. He had left one of Priscilla's bodies there to run things, but that wasn't the same thing. He wished he could check with Priscilla, but that wasn't possible. She only got information when the two worlds were connected. The same thing prevented him from communicating with his siblings when he was in a dungeon. The others were seated running through their own thoughts. Mash opened the portal to his own world. Let's go. We can talk inside. The biggest benefit of his having his own world was this. A safe and secure place to talk about whatever they wanted to. The value of that could not be understated. Mash entered his portal first. He didn't have to tell Priscilla to get information. She could read his intentions and start as soon as he stepped inside. He let her do that and turned towards the others as they entered. Red, who is Egan? Who's Egan? The question didn't just come from his mouth. Luke asked the same question as he entered. Luke had recognized the name but hadn't known much else. Jill was looking at Red with just as much curiosity. Red sighed but answered their prodding gazes. Egan Werman, otherwise known as Egan of the Scorched Lands, was a famous soldier. And I don't mean famous 10 or 100 years ago. I mean famous 1,000 years ago. He was a soldier on another continent as well. The southeastern continent of Thera. I'm fairly certain that the continent was named after him. Well, his king. Egan wasn't a simple soldier, but a direct vassal to the King of Flames. That was a name that Mash had recognized. Although, he only knew of the King of Flames for a single reason. He had conquered his entire continent and started to destroy foreign ones. He was the first and last king to try that. A cruel one if Mash remembered the story correctly. The King of Flames didn't seek to conquer. He simply destroyed the land he invaded. Forced people into slavery and burned the land as he moved. An impressive story for sure, and now Mash had an idea of how Egan got his name. Red wasn't done though. Most people know the King of Flames, but only nobles would be bothered learning about a common soldier. Even if he was one of the biggest contributors to the king's rise. Either way, Egan was well known for a single action. He didn't get his name from burning the lands overseas, though I'm sure he did that too. No, he got his name from something he did at home. The King of Flames only faced one real challenge when he united his home. The kingdom of a dozen sands had opposed him last, and they had more than enough mercenaries to fend off the king for years if needed. Although, they were defeated by a single man. A simple soldier, who should have earned much more attention. Red introduced many names that Mash didn't recognize. A kingdom, he didn't know, on a continent, he didn't care about. The next thing she brought up, he did recognize though. Egan had never given the kingdom the chance to fight back. To utilize all the mercenaries they had paid for. Egan destroyed it with a single attack. The story claimed that he brought the sun down. Scorched the kingdom and torched the lands until even the desert began to melt. Lava flooded the lands, and only fire monsters remained. Egan of the Scorched Lands received his name from creating the famous lava fields of Theras. That was something he knew. The open-mouthed stare on Luke's face said that he recognized it as well. Jill still seemed confused, but he didn't explain it. He just thought about what that meant. The lava fields were just that. Rivers of lava and melted stone had drawn powerful monsters to it. People even claimed that dragons would land there. To hear that a human made it was amazing. Although what he found odd was that he could believe it. He was beginning to understand what people from his world could accomplish. Turning a desert into a lava swamp didn't seem out of the realm of possibility. Although that alone would mean that Egan had lived for 500 years. He did wonder why Red knew so much, and why he hadn't heard the name before. While he wasn't the best at history, a person like Egan should not be unknown. Where did you learn all that? I learned it at home. Back when I still wanted to live up to the family. I think most notable families teach their children about the powerful people in the world. Especially those on other continents. Most normal wouldn't care though. They would never meet someone like that. Especially not anymore. The world no longer lets people like that fight normally. They get teleported to another space to fight with other people at their level. It happened with the demons. Oh yeah. I do remember that. Mash nodded along as he remembered what she meant. Although he knew that even that system was flawed. It temporarily stopped high-level people from destroying the world, but they were free to do it outside of a fight. The high-level demon that he had fought had nearly destroyed a city. And the king had killed every single demon when he rejoined the battle. The world delayed the destruction. It didn't stop it. Maybe it couldn't. Chapter 280, Worldly Values. Mash and the others talked for a little bit, but his thoughts shifted when Priscilla finished gathering her information. He had left one of her bodies to watch over his world. He trusted that she would act within his own beliefs. Some people might consider him insane for trusting a monster, but he was one too. Even if he didn't look like it all the time. The information went from Priscilla to him, and his mind drifted away from the others. Their words turned into buzzing in his ears. They had been talking more about everything that happened in the tower. It was important to know, but he couldn't help but let his thoughts shift. The elders and Kishiv in his world had done a lot. Although there was a more alarming change that he heard. The world was changing at this very moment. It had started a few hours ago. According to Priscilla, it had started around the time his skills had changed. She hadn't noticed when he had last come here, but now a few strange things had popped up. That being monsters. Monsters, specifically those he could imitate, had begun appearing in the world. Not just as infants either. Priscilla had noticed small creatures thus far. Rats like those he had fought so long ago. Some lesser animals had started appearing too. Fishes and birds. Those he would find on a farm or in a common store. He had never bothered making imitations of such creatures or trying out if he had forms for them. This suggested that he did, but it still didn't feel like he had any reason to try it. This information wasn't a good thing. While another food source was interesting, there were too many other concerns. The world was becoming less safe for his occupants, though Priscilla assured him that the people were safe. Even Kishiv children could handle things like the rats. Mash wondered how that was possible, but he guessed that it had to do with levels. Well, not levels but approximate strength. The rats he had fought when he had first become an adventurer were minor monsters. They would be too weak to appear even in beginner dungeons. The Kishiv on the other hand had been connected to a dungeon that he had gained access to from hitting level 100. The difference in strength made sense. Although there were other implications that rushed into his mind. His eyes darted around. They were on a small hill, and he tried to look into the distance. All he saw were trees, and strangely colored ones at that. They weren't like his trees anymore either. He didn't seem to control what appeared in this world, and where did come from. Was his magic creating real life somehow? If so, why couldn't he do that normally? And that meant that he was making real life. That shouldn't be possible. He wasn't regulating his world at all either. What would happen if another Priscilla formed? A creature like her could dominate his world. Not as long as I am here. If it is a replica of my old state, then I would be far superior to it. My body here has grown significantly in my absence. That was something he would address, but she wasn't his only concern. The winged cat thing, which he learned was known as a sphinx, was another danger. Plus, it was intelligent in a similar way to Priscilla. Even those creatures fell short of his strongest transformations. The wyvern and dragon would be horrible, and he didn't think the elders could do anything to them. Even still, those would be nothing if a dragon appeared. Mash could at least do something about the other monsters. He knew that he couldn't do anything if a dragon appeared. I have not noticed any creatures of worth. I will make sure to monitor for them. Priscilla was reading his thoughts and was trying to be reassuring. It fell on deaf ears. Or it entered a blank mind. Either way, Mash took little comfort in her composure. His friends would need to hear about it, but he paused as he realized that Priscilla had more to tell him. The Kishiv and elders have gained much from this world. According to them, there is a lot of valuable energy in the air. Enough to construct more complex creations than in their previous world. Many different kinds of wood exist, and they each hold different attributes. The wood grows quickly too. That is what is most dangerous to the people. The forest expands rapidly. Before long, your world will be nothing but forest and ocean. Though the elders and Kishiv have been cutting down trees as quickly as they can manage. Mash's stomach twisted at the thought. On top of the new life forms inhabiting his world, his people had to deal with ravenous forests. How did someone even fight a forest? Priscilla sent him many images along with her information. He saw what she meant. They were making more servitors as they called them, and they were elaborate. The wood they used now was easier to shape than the stone of their world. The images he had seen made it clear that the servitors they made now were much more humanoid. They were kind of like wooden training dummies, but Mash could see the value. They were creations that could use the natural attributes of the wood. He wanted to go explore the towns, but he needed to share the information with his friends first. Another long conversation began. The others listened closely, but they were open to walking and talking. Mash's portals seemed to open up to random places, but they were never too far away from the large tree. Plus, the tree was big enough to act as a guide regardless of location. But he could just head towards Priscilla's body if he really wanted to. They had appeared in a forest, but he hadn't really paid much attention to it at first. Priscilla's information changed his attitude and he stared at the trees. They were noticeable. Before they all somewhat matched the central tree, but now he could see that the trees were multicolored. They were all still somewhat brown, but they had a hue to them that made the forest disturbingly colorful. The trees ranged from yellowish hues to bright pink ones in some places. The leaves matched the hues on the trees too. All of the colors alone would have made the forest seem like it was from a children's book. However, the trees here took it a step further. The trees that were bluish actually dripped water from their leaves. Mash's feet froze when he spotted one. He slowly let the water fall on his open palm. Cold water pooled in his palm for a moment, before he raised it and took a sip. It was refreshing and clean. The water was so smooth that he thought it was something else at first. The others were just as surprised by the liquid. After they spotted that tree, they paid much more attention to the surrounding forest. Luke pointed out as a leaf from one of the red trees fell. It burned rapidly and turned to ashes before landing on the ground. They spotted another blue tree, though one that was a shade darker than the water ones. He only realized that it was different when it zapped him as he passed by it. It stung a little. Although, it wasn't any worse than the shock someone felt when touching some staticky. Interesting trees aside, they had run into a few mundane animals as well. The most common creature he saw was chicken, though Priscilla said there was plenty of fish as well. Mash considered his diet and decided that he would try and eat more normal creatures. They wouldn't give him power, but he should probably try and give this world more than just new monsters. Plus, he hoped that it would make it less likely for something like a dragon to appear. Were there any fruits or vegetables? Priscilla didn't know, but she said the world was still changing. She would send him information as her body discovered it. That was fine, but he was concerned about the world. It couldn't just survive off of random monsters and animals. There were things a place needed, and he doubted that his diet would cover everything. Did that mean he would need to eat bugs and stuff? The image didn't really disgust him as much as he thought it would. There were worse things out there, some of which he had already eaten. Jill pointed in the distance, and Mash saw buildings built into the forest. There were no walls, but he noticed smooth stone streets weaved between the structures. The stone at least was a plain grey. Any other color would have made the sight far too silly. The trees of the forest surrounded the streets and buildings, which he noticed were also built on a smooth stone floor. No walls felt risky to him, but Priscilla was quick to point out the reality. Up until a few hours ago, there were no harmful living creatures. And you requested that they make their cities as unobtrusive as possible. Even now there is nothing truly dangerous. The elders have built a few secure subterranean structures. There are some elevated safe spaces as well. Though infrequent, the storms in this world are dangerous. Mash appreciated the information but frowned at the images she sent along with them. The storms were terrible, the images he got were more like recollections of her memories. The sound and feeling came along with the image. The thunder roared across the ground, and the lightning shook the ground like an earthquake. The rains would be thick and could easily flood a poorly designed house. He was glad to hear that Priscilla had been able to prevent any serious injuries among the inhabitants. But all of the information made him feel kind of shitty. He had ruined their home and brought them here only to face new dangers. There were some apologies that needed to be made. He picked up the pace and talked quickly. The others listened as he explained the situation as Priscilla had seen it. They told him that he was overreacting. That he had come here recently, and Priscilla would have mentioned if the people here were struggling. It was true. So, he contained his reactions a little as the group arrived in the town. Village was probably a more appropriate word with the building layout. The buildings were made of wood but were placed on top of stone platforms. Everything in the village was like that. Mash had asked them to be unobtrusive, but this was excessive. The wood that lined the walls of the building was laid vertically next to one another. It reminded him of the paintings of elven villages he had seen. Priscilla told him not to stop at any of these buildings. Most of the buildings here just contained random families. The leaders of both the Kishiv and elders would be found deeper into the city. This was the only village at the moment, and he could tell that it was big. Buildings appeared in the corner of his eyes. They were hidden behind some trees, but the stone floors let him notice the many paths. They snaked into the forest and stretched toward the edges of vision. His world had changed from more than just his powers.